Hello, Isabelle Arradon. Really nice talking to you, and thank you for joining us on the Quaker Council for European Affairs series of interviews on the impact of COVID-19 on peace and security. So you are Director of Research at International Crisis Group. I wonder if you would like to just introduce your organization very briefly.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be able to talk to you this morning on COVID-19 and our work. So I am with International Crisis Group, and we are a conflict prevention organization which was set up in 1995. And basically we have analysts in different parts of the world who work near or in places of conflict, and they produce research and analysis in order to offer solutions to prevent or resolve deadly conflict.
Okay, thank you. So your organization published about a month ago a special briefing on 7 trends to watch on the COVID-19 impact on conflict. I wonder if you could share some of the main lines or any updates that you might have on that special briefing.
Of course. So about a month ago, the world was in a very different place. We had most of the population still on the move, of course. And now many in different countries, as I was thinking about Western Europe or parts of Africa or even Asia, are in lockdown, or populations have been asked to basically remove from any movement. But back then, indeed, at Crisis Group, we tried to understand what the future trends were as regards the spread of the pandemic, COVID-19. And what we anticipated, especially in places of conflict or potential conflict, which is what we focus on, was that there was a real risk of a humanitarian crisis in places where people were on the move, where we could see lots of internally displaced people. Because in those places, actually, the lockdown, the social distancing that has been in place, again, over the last few weeks in different places is very difficult to enforce. I'm thinking here about the refugee camp in Bangladesh, where about 1 million Rohingyas are housed. But I'm also thinking about places like Yemen or Syria, or even those on the move from Venezuela, where, of course, they are at a lot of risk in case COVID-19 gets in, because they will have very little access to medical support. And of course, they could die without people knowing. So very early on, we flagged this particular risk. What is happening now is that COVID-19 has managed to get in some places like Syria, like Yemen. I was checking the news this morning. Apparently, it has not get into the camps in Bangladesh, but of course, it is still a serious concern. We've seen in Gaza, where there are about 2 million people, COVID-19 has started to get in. And we are extremely concerned, of course, about the potential impact on this very vulnerable population. We've been calling for, of course, humanitarian aid to keep being provided, even though the response to COVID-19 is also having an impact on channeling humanitarian aid to populations. So this is something we are, of course, very concerned, and we are watching very carefully. So that's one point that was in our briefing, and we are continuing to look at. The second element, which I think is quite interesting, which was in our briefing, is the fact that we did express concern about the way governments were going to respond to COVID-19 and how it was going to be taken by local population. And I think here we're talking about trust. And clearly this has played out over the last few weeks. Depending on the level of trust between local population and their government, we've seen different reaction, and sometimes protests against particular lockdown, excess from security forces, like for example in Kenya. But we've seen also recently issues around the economic fallout when food prices increase, and protests from local population were basically going hungry, like in Colombia, for example. So how governments are basically managing the trust of their local population, how they're responding, is extremely key, and is going to be very important to watch in coming months. Another element we had flagged a few weeks back is the issue of election. We all know electoral processes don't play out in the same way in different places. We are in the business of conflict prevention, and we see that electoral processes need to happen in a context of trust. In many cases, elections have been postponed as a response to COVID-19, in Sri Lanka, for example, but also in Ethiopia, etc. Whereas it is important, of course, to take measures to prevent COVID-19, it is also very important to maintain those elections at some point and to not basically risk playing into authoritarian tendencies, which in the end will lead to backlashes. Maybe another element I will also highlight, but then I will ask you maybe to get a chance for clarification question, because there are so many different elements. But then there's an element that I think was interesting in our briefing is that we did highlight the potential weakening of mediation tools, because of course people cannot travel with the new measures imposed by COVID-19. Special envoys cannot get from one place to the other in order to support truth. We did flag the particular example of Afghanistan, because at the time the Taliban and the US had just come up with an agreement, and so it was very important to support a local Afghan process. But you know, if people can't travel, what does it mean? So we flagged that, and we flagged the concern that if Western governments are very busy with addressing COVID-19 inside their own territory, they may not pay as much attention to conflict prevention efforts elsewhere. And this is something that has played out in Libya. There were many efforts to resolve the conflict in Libya in February, but as we have shown in our Global Conflict Tracker Crisis Watch, the situation got worse in Libya in March, not better. So that could basically, lack of attention to the conflict of today could basically fuel more deadly violence in the future. So sustaining those mediation efforts despite all the restrictions is very important.
Thank you very much. You may know that Quaker Council for European Affairs, in its report Building Peace Together, but also in its advocacy, promotes gender equality through gender analysis and inclusivity. I wonder if you could share some of the thoughts that you've had in terms of the gender analysis of the impact of COVID-19 on peace and security.
Yes, thank you, Olivia. Well, I am no medical expert, but I understand COVID-19 is having a disproportionate effect on men. Men are more likely to die from the disease. So the related impact on women is that they may be left as economic providers. In situations of fragility or conflict or displacement, that means being forced to resort to particular challenging means. You know, they may have very few avenues basically to sustain the livelihood of their loved ones, and so could lead to forced marriages, could lead to survival sex, could lead to a range of effects that are not covered. And if there is a lack of humanitarian assistance or shortage, they could also suffer from that. So it's something to watch. But the other aspect we have looked very closely at crisis group is through our work on Al-Hol camp in Syria, where about 70,000 people are housed, mostly women and children. They are already suffering from various health conditions, and they are seen with a lot, of course, of antipathy from many people, because they are seen as related to ISIS. And if the disease gets in the camp, I think we could see many people dying. But more than that, what we have seen in a few weeks ago is also people trying to flee in some of the prisoner camps near Al-Hol, and so it could re-energize some ISIS sentiment if many were to die in alcohol, or it could lead to some wanting to leave the camp and so more people fleeing. In any case, this is something to watch. Overall, COVID-19 seems to be having a disproportionate impact on those who are most marginalized. So the poor, within the poor, those who may be outcast in particular context, and I think whatever response there is at the national, regional, or global level, it is important to pay attention to those populations that are usually discriminated against or disproportionately at risk in particular context. Of course, we know women and girls have also been looking at higher risk of domestic violence also in the West. So can you imagine in places of conflict or displacement? Those taboo subjects are more likely to be there.
Thank you very much. One last question, and just to try to finish on a slightly positive note, if positivity is possible in these dramatic times. The special briefing points to opportunities to seize, like humanitarian gestures between rival countries and other solidarity signs that we've seen in international geopolitics. Do you see any other silver lining coming out of this crisis?
Well, thank you very much for the question. It's of course very difficult right now to think about many positive elements, but as we were saying at Crisis Group, it's true that the tsunami back 10 years ago in the context of Aceh led to the peace agreement between GAM and the Indonesian government, and until now there is some sustained peace. So maybe COVID-19 in its own right could lead to positive elements. What we've seen is indeed the UAE, for example, allowing some humanitarian shipments to Iran. So in that sense, enemies could basically cooperate. So that is a good sign. Also, amid the call from the UN Secretary General for a global ceasefire, we've seen some positive steps in different places. Let's say in the context of the Philippines, Duterte made some positive gesture towards the communist insurgency. Also in Yemen, Saudi Arabia said that they would want to halt hostilities for about 2 weeks. Having said that, one can see in Yemen the conflict is still raging, and it's still very much an open war. So clearly, it is an opportunity. One would think COVID-19 is an opportunity for everyone to lay down arms and to stop the fighting, because there is a greater risk to the local population. And in order to sustain the trust of the local population, it's very important to protect their well-being and their health. But I am not very optimistic looking at what I am seeing. I'm seeing a lot of political manipulation of the COVID-19 responses in many contexts, and the poor, the most marginalized, paying the price for it. I fear there will be more demonstration in many places, excessive force by security forces, likely leading to deaths and people injured in different places of the world. And when the poor and the most marginalized are affected, it plays in the hands of those who want to take advantage of it. I'm thinking of criminal gangs in Latin America, and I'm also thinking of ISIS. We just published a briefing where we highlighted the fact that ISIS wants to make it an opportunity, the response to COVID-19, because that's the time to strike back. And of course, if many people lose their jobs, if many people have few opportunities, if there is a mishandling of the COVID-19 responses, if many people die out of a lack of global cooperation and assistance, it offers them again an opportunity. So I hope for the best, Olivia, but have my doubts.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Isabelle, for taking part in this initiative, and I look forward to continue the conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.